is how he places value on people we would otherwise overlook, those that we tend to push to the margins of life. Jesus holds up before us an entirely different set of priorities than what we are accustomed to prioritizing. But this really wasn't something new with Jesus. We find it time and again within the Old Testament as well. And so, for example, this morning we hear the story of Ruth. And it's a story that begins with trauma and tragedy. There's a man who had a family and they lived in Bethlehem. But famine struck the land. And so he did what anyone would do when they are desperate. He would take his family to where there was a place that had food. Even a place like Moab. Now that may not mean much to us when we hear that Elimelech took his wife Naomi and his sons Mahlon and Chilion and went to the land of Moab where there was indeed grain to be found, bread and food. But that's because we are not as intimately familiar with the Old Testament story as a whole. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, there is a law that says that no Moabite will ever become an Israelite. They will never enter into that relationship with God and God's people because of what had happened during the Exodus. You see, when the Israelites were still wandering in the wilderness, having escaped from Pharaoh in Egypt, there was a time when they needed food. And both the Ammonites and the Moabites turned them away empty. Because of that lack of hospitality, the law calls down this kind of a curse upon them. No self-respecting Israelite would ever go to Moab or Ammon for any good reason. So the only reason Elimelech took his family to Moab was in fact desperation. While they're there, their sons come of age. And they, as happens with young men, have their fancies turned towards women. Well, they cannot go home to find appropriate brides. So they do what they can. They find a couple of young Moabite women to make their brides. One's name is Orpah, the other's name is Ruth. And they begin to live as a family together in this strange place. But tragedy strikes again. Not only have they lost their homeland, but now they lose their provider. Elimelech dies. But Mahlon and Chilion are young men now, and so they continue to provide for their mother Naomi as well as for their new wives. But the tragedy becomes even greater when both of these sons die. Mahlon and Chilion. So we come to that part of the story where Naomi is left alone, bereft with grief, grief that no one should have to bear, the death of a spouse and the death of both of their children. She decides the only thing to do, the only thing that makes any sense in the world, is for her two daughters-in-law to return to their own people, to their own homes, so that their families would take them in and care for them and provide for them, that they would have a future. Naomi recognized that she could barely provide for herself, let alone for the three of them together. And Naomi herself will return to Bethlehem. The famine has ended. And there is provision in Israel for the widow and the orphan. Laws of gleaning provide for them to be able to eat a basic diet of sustenance. Even as Orpah has begun the journey home, Ruth clings to Naomi, refuses to leave her, pledging even that wherever you go, I will go, wherever you lodge, I will lodge, your people will be my people, and your God shall be my God. She leaves Naomi no choice but to allow Ruth to accompany her. They make the journey together back to Bethlehem. Upon her arrival, her friends and relatives recognize Naomi and are delighted to see her and call her by name, and she says, "No, don't ever call me that again." You see, Naomi means pleasant. She says instead, "Call me Mara," a Hebrew word that means bitter. Because that's what life has become for her. Bitter. Ruth loves her mother-in-law so much that she does what is necessary for both of them to survive. She goes to the fields and she begins to glean. A gleaning meant that those who had no source of provision could come. The widows, the orphans, the resident aliens could all come to the fields and follow behind the harvesters. It was a law that anything the harvesters missed or dropped was to be left, so that those in need could gather it up. That this was God's way of providing even for them. Naomi draws the attention of the man who owns the field she happens to be working in all day. He cannot help but notice how diligently she works, how hard she works. He begins to ask about her. He learns quickly that she is the Moabite daughter-in-law of Naomi. And Boaz recognizes Naomi as one of his relatives. So he turns to his supervisor and gives the instruction that all of the harvesters are to begin to intentionally miss some of the grain. and even more so intentionally drop some of what they have already gathered. Ruth returns home to Naomi at the end of the day with such a large glean that Naomi is astonished, begins to ask questions. Where did you get all this? Where were you working? She hears the name Boaz and recognizes it to be one of her kinsmen. Ruth explains that Boaz had come to her at the end of the day and promised that she could come to his field every day, and he would assure her safety. She would not be bothered or molested. She could work freely and without a concern for safety. And so it went through the season of harvesting the barley until the day came that all the barley crop was in. Nothing left to be gathered. Naomi realized that they needed a new plan, a new way forward in a sense. And so she began to talk to Ruth about what could be done. She explains how Boaz is busy at the threshing floor, and he's working day and night, and he's even sleeping there. So Ruth, go, get bathed and put on your best dress and your finest perfume, and under the cover of darkness, make your way to the threshing floor. Don't let Boaz know that you are there until after he's had plenty to eat and drink, and he has laid down to sleep. And then go over and uncover his feet and sidle up next to him and do whatever he tells you. Naomi has just given Ruth instructions on how to seduce Boaz. And Ruth says, I will do whatever you say. She goes, and when Boaz is awakened by her presence, he is surprised to find who it is. He commends her, not only for her diligence in caring for Naomi, but also for her wisdom. That she has not chased after younger men, but has come to a man of stability. He promises that he will see to her redemption, which is to say, under the laws of the Israelites, if a man died and had no brothers, there were other relatives that could have a right to redeem, that is, to claim and thereby provide an inheritance for the man. Boaz recognizes that he is not the nearest relative, therefore he does not have that first claim. But he will go to the public square and he will find that nearest relative. And he will see that Ruth is redeemed. And thereby a future and a hope provided. When the nearest relative rejects the opportunity because he wants nothing to do with a Moabite woman, Boaz makes his own claim. He takes Ruth as his wife. God provides them a child, and a son is born. The women of town celebrate the birth of the child. They declare that Ruth is better than even 7 sons to Naomi. That Naomi now has a child. And we are told that the women even named him Obed. Now, the punchline of the story, as wonderful as this is in terms of a story of redemption and of how one family managed to survive through trauma and tragedy, the real core of the story is about something else altogether. 6 times, the narrator of the story has told us that Ruth is a Moabite. Ruth the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite. He's drumming it into us who she is, so that we remember that this is someone under the law who will never be an Israelite. This is someone who, under the law, even to the 10th generation after her, will never be an Israelite. Will never stand among the people as they come to worship God. Back in the 23rd chapter of Deuteronomy, starting at the 3rd verse, it says, "No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of their descendants shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey out of Egypt. And because they hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you. Yet the Lord your God refused to heed Balaam. The Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loved you. You shall never promote their welfare or their prosperity as long as you live." A Moabite who gave birth to Obed, who became the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, the greatest king in all of Israel's history. The author of the book of Ruth knew the law from Deuteronomy. Knew that when David was king, it was problematic for the people because his great-grandmother was a Moabite. We remember what the law said. But you see, that's the point of the story. That greater than the law of God is the steadfast love of God. The chesed is the Hebrew word. Chesed is that faithful love of steadfast love, that love that will not let you go. A sing word that is used to describe Ruth's faithful love for Naomi. Same word that describes God, describes this outsider. So the story of Ruth is the question about who really are the insiders and who are the outsiders. That perhaps God's love is available and greater than we ever really imagined. And I think it raises for us, at least, a question to wrestle with in the midst of a national conversation about things like immigration. 3.5 million immigrants, 3.5 million illegal immigrants are those who were brought into this country by their parents when they were children. There was for them no choice, no decision in the matter. They were simply brought here. They have grown up in this country. They have been educated in our schools. Some of them have served in our military and still have no legal status. Maybe this ought to raise a question for us to wrestle with. We recognize that it's not a simple issue. Indeed, there are many nations that are wrestling with the question of immigration and of children that have been brought into the country. We call them dreamers because for many this is really the only country they have ever known or loved. And yet still, they do not belong. We weigh that over against the idea that if suddenly we give them status and citizenship, that may encourage more to come and do the same thing, and then it becomes a challenge. But maybe, as people of faith, this is still an issue we need to wrestle with. Because we claim to follow and serve a God who for us, above all else, is a God of steadfast love, of hospitality, and of grace. I don't offer you an answer, but I offer you an invitation to wrestle with the issue as an issue truly of faith. It seems to me the Jesus that we claim to love and follow has time and again challenged our preconceptions. And maybe in this, he's challenging us again. In the name of the Father, and